We're looking at this question related to the IS curve, where in part one we looked at how do we derive the expression for the IS curve and how do we find the slope and vertical intercept of the IS curve. Now we want to look at what is the sign of the slope and give some economic intuition of why is it downward or upward sloping. And so let's first look at the sign of the slope. So now from part one, now we're doing a part three here. So we know slope of IS curve, and this is given to us from part two. Slope of IS curve is given as, so slope of IS curve is given to us as minus 1 by V of 1 minus C1, 1 minus T. Right, so this is the slope of the IS curve, and this we found in part 1 already. So now over here, now the idea is that we know okay, this is a minus sign, so this is negative. V is positive, so 1 by V is positive. Now this entire expression is also positive as C1 is between 0 and 1 and T is between 0 and 1. So C1 1 minus T is also between 0 and 1, right? Because C1 is a fraction, T is a fraction. So when you do 1 minus T, that's a fraction. So when you multiply two fractions, C1 1 minus T, we get another fraction. And when we subtract that from 1, we get a positive number. So this means this is negative, this is positive, this is positive. So overall, this slope is less than 0, which means so IS curve is downward sloping. And which is what we would expect it to be downward sloping because it has a negative slope, so it is downward sloping. Now let's look at some economic intuition of why the IS curve slopes downwards. Economic intuition. Slopes downwards. So we know the way we derive the IS curve is we change interest rate and we see what happens to output to maintain goods market equilibrium. So now when I decrease R, we know what happens. We know I increases. And we know why that's true. Because we know I depends negatively on R, right? So if R decreases, I will increase. Right? And when investment increases, we know demand increases. And why is that? We know because Z is made up of C plus I plus G. Right? So investment is one of the components of demand. So as investment increases, demand increases. So the demand schedule shifts up in our goods market model. Because remember, the IS curve has in its background the goods market model. And when demand increases, when the demand schedule shifts up in the goods market model, we know that causes Y to increase through the multiplier effect. Right, so this is why the IS curve is downward sloping. This is the economic intuition behind it. You decrease interest rate, that increases investment, which increases demand. And we know as the demand schedule shift upwards in our goods market model, output increases through the multiplier effect. So this was part three. Now part four tells us to determine how the slope of the IS curve depends upon B, how sensitive investment is to interest rate, and on C1, which represents our MPC. Now, before we do this, we need to look at what do we mean when we say the IS curve is steep versus the IS curve is flat. So, to do part four first, let's see what it means when we say IS curve is steep versus IS curve is flat. What's the difference between the two? We want to look at that. So for this, recall that we derive the IS curve by changing interest rate and seeing what happens to output to maintain goods market equilibrium. So now the idea is that as slope increases in absolute value, so we're talking about the absolute value of the slope because we know that the IS curve slope will be negative because it's downward sloping. But we're talking about the magnitude of the absolute value of the slope. Because if you have a slope -2 and -5, both indicate the downward sloping. But because in absolute terms, -5 is larger, so that will be a more steeper curve, right? Because we're talking about the absolute value of the slope to see whether it's flat or steep. So as slope increases in absolute value, we'll have a steeper IS curve. So now let's see if we have a steeper IS curve and flat IS curve, what does that mean? So let's make two diagrams. So one is this, and this is the flatter IS curve we can see, and let's make another one, more steeper IS curve. Right, so this is flatter IS curve, and this is steeper IS curve. So now let's try to understand what's the difference between them. So this was obviously if you label the x's, this is r, this is r, this is. Say we start with an interest rate R1 in both cases, and in both cases, we reduce the interest rate to R2. So now, when that happens, we can see in the case of the flatter IS curve, this is the increase in output that we observe from Y1 to Y2. But in this case, notice that the increase in output for the same change in interest rate is very small, right? So over here, when we change interest rate from R1 to R2, we have a much larger increase in output when we have a flatter IS curve versus the steeper IS curve. So steeper IS curve means that a given change in interest rate will have smaller change in output in goods market will have smaller change in output in goods market equilibrium. So that's what we mean when we say the IS curve is steep. So the more the steeper the IS curve is, then a given change in interest rate will only have a small change in output in the goods market equilibrium. Now we'll look at what factors determine this steepness and flatness. So we'll start with looking at sensitivity of investment to interest rate, right? So now let's see how interest sensitivity of investment, how interest of investment, i.e. B in this model that is represented by B affects the slope of IS curve. Let's see how that affects it. Now from A2, we know, okay, from A2, we know the slope of the IS curve, which I'm writing that MIS is given to us as minus 1 by B, 1 minus C1, 1 minus. Now we can see over here, okay, as B increases, it's in the denominator. So we know the slope will decreases in absolute value, right? In magnitude, in terms of the absolute value, the slope will go down because B is in the denominator. And as slope goes down, this means we'll get a flatter IS curve. And we know what a flat IS curve means. A given change in interest rate will result in a larger change in output. Now let's try to understand why when investment is more sensitive to interest rate, do we have a flatter IS curve? So let's look at the economic conclusion behind this again. We're showing algebraically based upon the So for the IS curve, that because B is in the denominator, as B increases in terms of absolute value magnitude, the slope will go down. So as a result, we'll have a flatter IS curve. But let's look at the economic intuition now. What is the economic intuition behind this? So for this, we need to recall something, the way we derive the IS curve. We know that when we derive the IS curve, interest rate decreases, and that causes investment to increase, and that increases Y. Now we need to understand that the decrease in R, how much it increases investment, this depends upon B. So the B plays a part over here, right? When R decreases, how much does I increase depends upon how sensitive investment is to changes in interest rate. Where if investment is highly sensitive, if investment is highly sensitive to interest rate, we have a higher B, then a given decrease in interest rate leads to large increase in investment. Right, so for a given decrease, because if interest rate is if investment is very sensitive or responsive to interest rate, so when interest rate goes up, we'll see a very large increase in investment. And when there's a large increase in investment, therefore, big shift of demand schedule. So there'll be a much bigger shift of our demand schedule when Z increases in our goods market model. Therefore, large increase in output. And we know that when for a given change in interest rate, when we see a larger increase in output, that's when we have a flatter IS curve. That's the economic intuition behind why when investment becomes more sensitive to interest rate, we have a flatter IS curve where any given change in interest rate causes a bigger increase in output. That is because when investment is more sensitive to interest rates, in this particular pathway, the increase in investment is more, which will mean the demand schedule will shift up more in the goods market model. So as a result, we'll see a much larger increase in output for a given change in interest rate, and we'll have a flatter IS curve. We can also graphically illustrate this. If you want to show this graphically, so what we can do is, let's plot our goods market model over here. This is Z and this is Y. And here we plot interest rate R and Y. So we have our 45-degree line, and let's make our demand schedule. Z is equal to C plus I R naught plus G. And this is our equilibrium output Y naught. So let's start with the equilibrium output Y naught and interest rate R naught. So we start with this point. Now what we do is, now first let's consider the increase. So let's now consider investment increases, but for smaller B, right? So in the case of a smaller B, if investment increases, this will be the new demand schedule. If we have small b, right? If there's a small b, so we're saying that as interest rate decreases from R0 to R1, and this will cause investment to increase, which will cause the demand schedule to shift upward. So this is the case of the relatively small b. So in this case, we can see this is equilibrium output, and we can plot it over here. And we know this is associated with a lower interest rate R1, Y1. So when you connect this, we get our downward sloping IS curve. Sorry. So we get our down. Okay, this does not look good. Just a second. Okay, this is like this. Right. So now what if we had a larger B? If we had a higher B, right? If the B was larger, if investment was more sensitive to interest rate, and then in that case, when interest rate went down from R0 to R1, we would have a larger increase in investment and a larger increase in demand, maybe something like this. Then Z prime would be this C plus I R1 plus G. So this is a larger B. Right, so in the case of a larger B, we're saying the increase in equilibrium output would have been this much. So then for the same interest rate, this would have an equilibrium output, right? Y1 would have been this. So in this case, we connect the original point R0, Y0 with this R1, Y1. And what we will see is that we'll get, because this does not look really good, but the point I hope has gone across. Let me just make this again. So this was the, with the smaller b, this was the IS curve. Now with the larger b, we're connecting the red points together. So this is like this, right? So we can see the IS curve is flatter in this case, right? So this is with larger b. So this is IS with larger b, and this is IS with smaller b. Right, so this is the idea over here, right? So basically we're showing how sensitivity of investment to changes in interest rate will affect the slope of the IS curve. You can clearly see the one with the larger B has a flatter slope, because when interest rate decreases from R0 to R1, we can see that when we have a larger B, then the demand schedule shifts up more, where the shift is represented by the red line. If we had a smaller B, then demand schedule would only shift upwards as much as is represented by the blue line. And the more the demand schedule shifts up, the more the increase in equilibrium output will be. And thus, for a given change in R, we see a larger increase in output and it's a flatter IS curve. So now I want to see, how does MPC affect the slope of the IS curve? How MPC affects slope of IS curve? How MPC IEC1 affects slope of IS curve. Now, from A2, we know that the slope of the IS curve is -1, sorry, by B, 1 minus C1, 1 minus T. So here we're increasing C1, right? So we can see over here, as MPC, or what is C1 increases, slope decreases in absolute value, right? It will decrease in absolute value magnitude, right? Because over here we have a larger C1, so we're subtracting from one a larger number, so overall we're going to get a smaller number over here. So the slope is going to go down in absolute value. So as a result, we're going to get a flatter IS, which means that for the given change in interest rate, we will have a larger change in output. Now let's look at economic intuition of Y. Let's look at the economic intuition. So again, recall, we said when R decreases, I increases, and this is affected by B. Y increases. And what plays a role over here is the multiplier. So when investment changes and demand changes and output changes through the multiplier effect. So how much will Y change in response to the change in R will depend upon the multiplier in this case. So now, so the idea is that when, and this multiplier, so before we move ahead, and this multiplier depends on MPC C1. So this path over here, like we talked about, depended upon how sensitive investment is to changes in interest rate. This depends upon the multiplier, which in turn depends upon the MPC C1. So the idea is this: as MPC increases, the multiplier increases. We know why. We know the multiplier effect works through changes in C. At every stage of the multiplier process, as income increases, C increases, and how much C increases depends upon MPC. The greater the MPC is, the more consumption will increase every time income increases, and hence the greater the multiplier effect will be. So multiplier increases, which means a given change in investment demand causes large increase in output. And hence, we know when for a given change in interest rate, we have a large increase in output, we have a flatter risk. Right, so we know, so the MPC, how does it affect the so-called IS curve? It works through the multiplier, because when you have a larger multiplier, so when investment will change, you will have a larger increase in output through the multiplier. So in short, we have seen slope of IS curve. So if we just summarize what we've seen here, so in short, slope of IS curve is affected by both MPC C1 and 2 interest sensitivity of investment, how responsive investment is to changes in interest rate, i.e. B1, right? Because we know when R decreases, that causes I to increase, which causes Y to increase. And we know the interest sensitivity of investment plays a part over here because when R decreases, how much does I increase depends upon how sensitive or responsive investment is to changes in interest rate. And when I changes, that changes demand, it changes output through the multiplier effect. So the change in Y due to the change in I depends upon the multiplier, which depends on C1. So that is all as it is.